Dragon Ball Z Budokai and the Legacy of Goku, which sounds like a really weird title of something, doesn't
It
it?
sounds like a thesis.
What do you know about Dragon Ball Z?
I don't know particularly much, admittedly. I know that it's a sequel of sorts to the original Dragon Ball, which was a manga, later anime drawn by Akira Toriyama. I know that it loosely follows the plot of the Monkey Prince from Chinese folklore legends. Journey to the West, that's the name of it. I was struggling there. And I do know a few character names and character designs, although I would struggle to match up names to designs. Other than that, not very much at all. I only ever watched maybe 10 episodes 20 years ago. That I believe that was the Cell saga, and I could not tell you what happened in it at all, other than there was a big green dude. That's the sum of my knowledge.
That just sums up all of Dragon Ball Z to me. Actually, that sums up all anime, doesn't it? There's just a big green dude.
Big green dude.
Big green. There's always a big green dude. Anyway, yeah, okay. So I'm a big fan of Dragon Ball Z. The Dragon Ball was the original series written by Akira Toriyama and God rest his soul. I think it was like 84. I think it was originally written, but the anime for Dragon Ball came out in 86. The animated to Dragon Ball Z, the follow-up, started in 1989, and the animated, the third and not so final series anymore, Dragon Ball GT, came out in 1996, and that was in Japan. Then in the States, Dragon Ball, I think the first 13 episodes of it were released and then not as well received by Western audiences. So then they jumped to Dragon Ball Z because it's far more action-packed. So Dragon Ball, you just touched, was touched upon the Journey to the West element. Dragon Ball Z turned into its own thing, and it became very much like Power Rangers in a sense. And it fit very much in with that time. At the time, the stuff that was out as well was obviously like Sailor Moon and Pokemon. And there was a bit more like, let's sell toys, right? To be totally honest, I don't know if that was the entire aim of it, but it was a lot more. I'm more powerful than you are. You're more powerful than I am. And less nuanced and more about the battles and the testosterone and whose shirt could be ripped the most and all that sort of stuff.
Very shonen.
Very shonen. Then it started. It was dubbed in the States and Dragon Ball Z onwards in 1996. So as it ended in Japan, and then it was put into syndication in the States in 1996, and then it hit Cartoon Network in 1998, and then it started taking over the world. Now, we got it in the UK, according to some forum years ago, on the 6th of March 2000. And everyone loved it for about a year or so, and then they started going, I don't like that. Because it's really childish, but they still watched it, right? It's one of those, right? Because we always want to be into that. It's cartoony and kiddie, and then it became the most popular show in the series. Clearly, someone was lying somewhere. But we had it 2 years after it came on in the States, so we had like a massive backlog of episodes. So we didn't have the same storyline things. There's lots of story beats from the series that you would have got over time. You would have had to wait for the next episode in America. In the UK, we got almost everything at once in 2000. Almost like the first 170 odd episodes, something ridiculous.
Jesus.
So we had it. So it's very difficult to take in because if you start at certain points in the series, the show is very episodic, and you can marathon it, and it's not very hard because of the fact that it's not necessarily a particularly deep story. There are some deeper elements to it. You can dip in and pretty much know what's going on. That person there with yellow hair is the goodie. Because we get it 2 years after the States, obviously we didn't get it the same way because of that. But then we caught up. So we ended up like dubbing. We had a different dubbing studio, I think in Canada as well, and in the UK. Dubbed like the last 100 episodes very, very quickly. So we ended up finishing the series at the same time as the US. So we got 2 years later and then ended at the same time. So a lot of those episodes are very ropey in terms of the dubbing. Funny enough, talking about dubbing voices earlier. Pretty bad. It's notorious for being quite, whoa, what is going on here?
He's doing it! Awesome!
This is incredible!
I taught him that technique.
Attaboy! Hey guys, you feel that? Whoa.
Is that my dad?
Yeah.
But what I learned, that's the kind of framing device in history, is that we got it out later and we weren't considered part of this stuff. So obviously Japan got most of the stuff early on. It was finished by the time it became a thing in the West. So what is interesting is that some of the games that came out with Dragon Ball Z, because Dragon Ball Z is definitely a multi-media franchise. It's not just about the anime or the manga. It is about the games as well. But most of them are fucking terrible, right? So it's not like Pokemon. It's not like Pokemon where there's an anime, a card game, and then a game series, and they're all solid in their own way. It is like most of the Dragon Ball Z games are fucking awful, and some of them are top notch, but only if you like Dragon Ball Z. And then a couple of them are pretty good games in their own right. But apparently, the first games that were released in Europe for Dragon Ball Z were games called Dragon Ball Z Super Butoden, November the 30th, 1993, Dragon Ball Z Super Butoden 2 in 94, and then Dragon Ball Z Super Butoden 3 in January the 25th, 1995. And they were those Street Fighter type fighting games, right?
Okay.
They came out in Europe, and I'm like, okay, well, hang on a minute. Like, we didn't get this until much later. So maybe this was our first exposure to it. What's going on? Like we talked about in the last episode about exposure to anime. But it turns out they only came out in Spain and I think it's Italy.
Right, okay.
So they didn't come out in the UK. Now, the only reason I can think why that was, because the anime wasn't released in Europe. The games came out, perhaps cashing in on the Street Fighter thing. The only reason I can think why that was, and I'd love to dig into this more, was because of the whole thing around the fact that certain Japanese iconography was banned in the UK. Are you familiar with this?
Right, yes, I do remember reading something about that actually relatively recently. I believe the way that I read about this recently was weren't the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles called something different because the word ninja itself was actually like banned over here?
It was. Do you know who brought
Which is
that
just
banning?
insane.
Do you know who brought that banning in, or who is synonymous with bringing that banning in?
I want to say Margaret Thatcher. Just
Yeah, it
because
was. There
everything's
we
her
go.
fault. Yes.
Thanks, Thatcher. Thanks a lot for because the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that's the famous one. Because if you watch the theme song of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, it's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. We have Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, and there's a bit
Oh,
where
that just
like
sounds awful.
where there's a bit where like the word ninja is like Splinter taught them to be ninja teens is one of the lyrics, and it's Splinter taught them to be hero teens, and you can hear the first N in the theme song. It's the Splinter taught them to be hero teens. It's like
God.
Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. Splinter taught them to be fighting teens.
He's a radical rat.
yeah, thanks a lot, Maggie. So yeah, so I assume that's why. Because and I thought it was fascinating because it essentially came out in Europe. I thought, oh my god, is this like was there a cult following for this type of game beforehand? And this is what's really interested me about this. It was Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22 in 1996. And as far as I know, it's like a similar like Street Fighter type game. The only interesting thing about it is you can fly up in the sky. It's not very good. But apparently it came up in Europe in 1996, and I have nothing to disprove the fact that it came out in the UK. I'd love to look into it. I've looked through my official PlayStation magazine history from around the time, and it's not in the index in that, which means it wasn't reviewed, presumably. But it would be. I'd love to find out whether the people have memories of this, thinking, "What the fuck is this?" before the actual series came out. That would be great to know. Because I know you can get it. I don't know whether it was reprinted later, because we had a game that came out later called Dragon Ball GT Final Bout in 1997, which didn't come out in Europe in 1997. It came out in 2002 when the series came to fruition. So I don't know whether Ultimate Battle 22 was like that, but it certainly came out before the next game I'm going to talk about. That's a lot of framing to talk about Dragon Ball Z Budokai. So that was the first real Dragon Ball Z experience we got along with the series. So a supplement to the series, like the Pokemon cards would have been with the anime, or the Pokemon game or whatever would have been with the anime. Oh, I can play this as well. Are you familiar with the Budokai game at all? Or
I have heard the title. I've probably seen it on shelves before. I haven't played it for myself.
Yeah, I think Budo's like fighting. I think
that would make sense then.
so Tenkaichi Budokai was the name of the tournament in Dragon Ball, which was the #1 under the sun fighting tournament. So Budo means fighting. I don't know what Kai means. I'm not really that clued up on the Japanese language. But effectively, this was like a 3D fighting game. Now, what was mind-blowing about this was on the PS2. So I mentioned in the Final Fantasy X discussion we had earlier around my friend's 11th birthday and how it was my first exposure really to playing the PS2. I've played it before, but I hadn't played the PS2 library yet. He had this game on that day as well, and it was like, oh my god, this is incredible. So that was one of the games that from my first exposure to the PS2. And what was mind-blowing about this is you could transform in the middle of the battle.
Ooh, okay.
Like, so you like obviously nowadays we could do that with everything, but like you just press the shoulder buttons together and then you go from being a base state as Goku and then you become a Super Saiyan with his yellow hair. And it was like, you could do it in battle. Oh my god, this is incredible. Of course, then later on, if you get damaged, you go back to the level you were at before. So it wasn't like a Sonic the Hedgehog situation where you transform and that's it, you transform forever, or Pokemon where you evolve and you transform forever. It's like you could control the transformation. Okay. And it was like the first time where I felt like that thing I discussed before with the Power Rangers. I was a big Power Rangers kid, or Sailor Moon, which I watched and didn't tell anyone about, like most guys my age, things like that, where it was like, wow, we're playing this in the game. We're actually like being able to transform into our next form and then go back down. And that was just like mind-boggling to me. So 2 years after the anime aired in 2002, I played it in 2003. I remember running to my friend's house to play this because he had a PS2 and I didn't. And this was the change for me. Eventually, it came out on the GameCube and I got it, but it was basically the game that made me want to get a PS2. It turned it for me because the reason I really got a GameCube was because of Sonic, because Sega went down in terms of their console production, and Sonic went onto the GameCube, so I got that. And then we got also the Legacy of Goku 2, which was a Game Boy Advance game, which I had myself in 2003, and it's pretty fucking terrible. Like, it's notorious for being bad, but it was the only. This is the thing. The point I'm trying to make with this, with like games, is that like Budokai 1, it's a solid fighting game. It probably wouldn't have been well received unless you were playing as Dragon Ball Z characters. But I would argue that a lot of people with the transformation things, I don't think that was necessarily a thing in fighting games up until that point. I'd love to be corrected on that, but that might have got anime fans interested, even if they weren't Dragon Ball Z fans, should we say. It's basically like a Zelda style action RPG. You punch things, but it's really, really not particularly well programmed. You Goku, you're supposed to be one of those powerful beings in the universe. You could blow planets up with your fist, but you get killed by dogs in the middle of roads and stuff like that.
Listen, don't discount the power of dogs.
Yeah, well, it's killed by like random dogs in the forest, and snakes in the forest that can kill you. Yeah, so it's quite. And most of the game is you just walk around fighting dogs and snakes and not doing anything to do with Dragon Ball Z whatsoever. But it was pretty mind-blowing because it was on the GBA. It had cutscenes from the series. It had like the opening cutscene in a really lossy, terrible quality.
The only quality
but
that
it just
matters.
goes to show. I mean, nowadays Dragon Ball Z is everywhere. You can't go anywhere without experiencing Dragon Ball Z. You go to Comic-Con, someone's dressed as Goku. There's Dragon Ball Z stuff everywhere. Every series is out. It's on every console. You've got everything known to man is there. And it's just amazing going back to a time where, like, even if it wasn't such a good experience or a good game, you would still cling to it as being. So I would say it was like an impactful game, even though it's dreadful. So that's kind of my take on it. There is there's a little bit of a snapshot into the history of Dragon Ball Z media, in that it's a massive media thing now, but at one point you had to cling to what you could get, which is something that I think is very much a 90s kids thing. You got drip fed a little bit of stuff. And so that's my take on that brief history of Dragon Ball Z. Probably a bit of a self-indulgent thing to talk about. But so any thoughts on that, or just
I think it's kind of absolutely insane, like not being into Dragon Ball. It's one of those things that, like, I completely understand the cultural impact of it. It just doesn't appeal to me in any way.
Yeah.
But knowing that it is so big and it is absolutely everywhere in the world. I mean, you've probably seen all the photographs of, like, Goku over Mexican street vendors and things like that. Like, he is everywhere. He is the patron saint of everybody in the world at this point. But to know that even something so big had such humble beginnings in a way is kind of insane. Like, just knowing how big and influential it became worldwide, and knowing that even stuff like the games weren't given as much love and care as they should have been, like, that's almost mind-blowing to me.
It is, and it's amazing how these things develop differently in Europe, NA, and Japan. Obviously, Japan, it makes sense that it was, these were big events. The movies would come out of this series at like every couple of years. It was a big deal before we'd even heard of it. Before the West had even heard of anime, let alone Dragon Ball Z. So we got it much after the fact. So it's amazing how those three, I guess, obviously I know that like it's a big in South America as well, but like, and there are other parts of the world that love it. But like, if you think about like Asia, Europe, and then Americas, it's been released to those territories in very, very different ways, but everyone's resonated with it, which I just don't understand. I can't put my finger on why, because I don't think it's especially deep, the story or anything like that. I don't know whether it's the themes, but it's just something about it. It's just.
I did recently see, in the wake of Toriyama's passing, and rest in peace to Toriyama. He really was a genius at what he did. But I did see a very interesting post which talked specifically about the artwork of Dragon Ball and how clean it was and how easy to follow, and how different it was to a lot of other shonen manga of the time. And in no way am I a scholar of like 80s shonen manga. I would be pressed to find examples off the top of my head, but knowing that a lot of action is usually very difficult to draw and oftentimes quite messy on the page, versus Toriyama's very clean, very easy to follow battle sequences. Even if they did take up, pages and panels, you can still tell exactly what's happening. Guy A kicks Guy B, and you can follow that kick, as opposed to just, okay, well, there's a lot of lines on the page. I know you mentioned earlier about Attack on Titan, and I've seen, it's not a series that I've read, but I have seen the artwork, and it's, again, one of those things that looks like it would be quite difficult to follow in an action scene. I read for the first time a year or two ago Chainsaw Man, and while I really enjoyed that, the artwork in the action scenes was nigh impossible for me to follow. I just really didn't have a clue what was going on. So
no, really, really a series that I hold dear to my heart, and it's nice to think about. Because I've revisited some of these games recently. To be fair, with Dragon Ball Z Budokai, there were lots of sequels, and they improved upon the game very, very quickly. And Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3 is an absolute classic. I think it's the Dragon Ball Z fans' favorite game, really. But on its own, it's a good game as well. Even if you don't like Dragon, it's a good entry point for the series as well. Is a fair thing to say. There's a couple of other Dragon Ball Z games, but there's a game called I think it's Super Dragon Ball Z, which was an arcade fighter that was ported to PS2, I believe. And that, in its own right, if you're a fighting game fan, you'll like, even if you don't like Dragon Ball Z necessarily. So there are a few like that, but mostly they are indulgent fan service projects for the fan base, which is interesting considering, like you say, the humble beginnings of whatever. We just it seemed to be less care given to it somewhat. And I think that Dragon Ball Z Legacy of Goku was a Western game. It wasn't developed by a Japanese studio. It was a Western game.
Right.
So it was almost like what the West had pieced together with their limited knowledge of the series. And it's just an interesting time capsule to something that we perceived a different way,
Subscribe to EXP Required.